For more than 2,000 years, the art of war has been the masterclass in strategy. Its author, Sun Tzu, is an absolute legend. But what if the legend isn't the real story? Today, we're going to play detective and dig into the history of one of the world's greatest military thinkers.
You've heard the quotes, right? I mean, this wisdom is so timeless that generals, CEOs, and even football coaches still use it today. But the man behind the words? Well, that's where things get really interesting. So here's the question we're tackling. Was Sun Tzu a real-life general, a brilliant literary creation, or something in between?
Okay, let's start with the story everyone knows. Our main source on Sun Tzu's life comes from the ancient historian Sima Qian. And you have to understand, his account, written centuries after Sun Tzu supposedly lived, it's pure cinema. It's the story that has defined Sun Tzu for millennia. So the legend goes like this. The king of Wu, a guy named Ho Lu, gets his hands on Sun Tzu's book, The Art of War, and he's blown away. But he wants to see if this stuff actually works. He asks Sun Tzu, "Can you apply this to women?" Sun Tzu says, "Sure." So they bring out 180 of the king's concubines. Sun Tzu explains the drill commands, gets the drums ready, and gives the order. And the women just start laughing. Sun Tzu doesn't even blink. He says, "Okay, if the commands aren't clear, it's the general's fault." So he explains everything again. They do the drill, and again, the women just giggle and ignore him. This time, Sun Tzu's tone changes. He says, if the orders are clear and the soldiers still disobey, then it's the fault of their officers. And with that, he orders the execution of the two women he'd put in charge, who just so happened to be the king's two absolute favorites. Now the king is watching this all go down, and he completely panics. He sends a message, begging Sun Tzu to spare them. But look at this response. Sun Tzu basically says, "Sorry, Your Majesty, but you made me a general, and on the battlefield, my authority is absolute." He was making a point. Discipline is everything, and the executions went ahead. Can you imagine the scene after that? Sun Tzu beats the drum a third time, and this time, the women snap to attention. They go through the drills perfectly, in dead silence. Sun Tzu turns to the king and says, "Sire, your soldiers are ready." The king, probably still in shock, realized this guy knew what he was doing and made him his top general. And according to the legend, Sun Tzu then led the armies of Wu to a massive victory against their rivals, the state of Chu.
It's an incredible story, isn't it? It has everything. The problem is, when we look at other, more contemporary historical records, the story starts to fall apart. This is where we find the first major crack in the case of Sun Tzu.
So you have Sima Qian's history, the Shi Qi, which gives us that amazing dramatic tale. But then you have this other text, the Tzu Chuan. And this is a huge deal, because the Tzu Chuan is our best, most detailed, day-by-day account of what was happening during that exact time. It's packed with details about battles, political moves, and important figures, and yet, there is not a single mention of a general named Sun Wu. Nothing. A much later scholar, Ye Shui-sin, really hit the nail on the head with this. The Tzu Chuan mentions all sorts of minor players, officers, diplomats, even some random thugs. So how could it possibly leave out the mastermind general who supposedly won Wu's biggest war? The silence is just deafening. For a lot of historians, this is proof that the legendary Sun Tzu never existed. Okay, so the story of the man might be shaky, but what about the book? This is where our investigation takes a turn. We have to separate the legend of the man from the reality of the manuscript, because the book itself has a story to tell. You see, even if we can't prove the man was real, scholars are pretty confident the book, The Art of War, is authentically ancient. The writing style fits perfectly with other texts from that era, around the 5th century BC. It uses old words that were already out of fashion a couple hundred years later. It talks about social systems like land ownership that disappeared. And it's obsessed with stuff like armored chariots, the cutting-edge military tech of its day, but ancient history not long after. And beyond all that, just read it. It doesn't sound like some philosopher in an ivory tower. The advice is sharp, it's practical, it's full of gritty common sense. It feels like it was written by someone who had actually been on a battlefield, who knew the smell of mud and the fear of an ambush. This sounds like the real deal, written by a real soldier.
So now we have a puzzle. A legendary general who probably didn't exist, but an authentic book that feels like it was written by an expert. So what if the key to solving this whole thing has been hiding in the book itself this whole time?
Let's ask that question directly. If we ignore the legend for a second and just listen to the author's own words, can we figure out when and where he was writing? Oh, yes, we can.
There are a couple of passages that are basically a giant flashing sign.
Check this out. The author is speaking as if he's from the state of Wu, and who does he name as the main enemy? The state of Yuek. He's not just mentioning them, he's focused on them, even noting that they have more soldiers.
And then there's this little gem. When the author needs a perfect example of two mortal enemies, who does he pick? The men of Wu and the men of Yu. It's like saying cats and dogs or Yankees and Red Sox. For him, this was the rivalry. This tells us the book was almost certainly written when the conflict between Wu and Yu was at its absolute peak.
Now let's look at the timeline. The legend from Sima Qin places Sun Tzu right here, during the big war between Wu and Chu. But back then, Wu's number one enemy wasn't Yu, it was Chu. The book is obsessed with Yu, a rivalry that only gets really heated after the war with Chu. This is the smoking gun. The book seems to have been written later than the legend says, during a completely different conflict.
So, with this new timeline, we can actually start to put the pieces together in a way that makes sense. We don't have to throw everything out. We can build a new, much more believable story for who the author of The Art of War really was.
Here's what most likely happened. Sun Wu was a real person, a soldier serving the state of Wu. But he probably wasn't a top general, which explains why he's not in the official records. He lived through the big war with Chu, and then wrote his brilliant book later, right when the new existential threat from Ye was exploding. Then, over the centuries, his book became so famous, so legendary, that people needed an equally legendary story for its author. So they attached his name to the most famous victory of his time, and poof, the myth of the great general was born. The legend grew to match the genius of the book, not the other way around.
So in the end, the all-powerful general from the stories, he might just be a myth. But he was a myth invented to explain the undeniable brilliance of a very real book, written by a very real, battle-tested soldier named Sun Wu. And that really leaves us with one last question to think about. Does solving this mystery take away from the book's power? Or is the wisdom in The Art of War just so profound that in the end, it doesn't really matter who wrote it?